After 3 weeks of sunbathing with his mistress, my husband finally strutted into the maternity ward to meet our son. The head nurse just stared at his designer luggage and smiled coldly. "Your wife left 3 weeks ago," she told him. "Let me tell you how I turned his tropical getaway into a permanent eviction from my life and dismantled his entire fake empire brick by brick." The fluorescent lights of the delivery room were blindingly bright, reflecting off the sterile linoleum floor. I had been in active labor for 14 grueling hours. Every monitor in the room beeped in a chaotic symphony that matched the agonizing tightening in my abdomen. I gripped the plastic rails of the hospital bed, my knuckles turning white as another wave of pain ripped through me. I reached out blindly, expecting to find my husband's hand. Instead, my fingers grasped empty air. I opened my eyes and turned my head. Kendrick was not beside me. He was standing by the heavy wooden door, adjusting the strap of his leather weekender bag and checking the time on the gold Rolex I had bought him for our anniversary. The scent of his expensive cologne hung heavy in the room, completely at odds with the sweat and clinical smells of a labor ward. "Kendrick," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking as I tried to breathe through the contraction. "Where are you going?" I did not even look up from his phone screen. His thumbs moved rapidly, typing out a message before he finally slipped the device into his tailored jacket pocket. He walked over to the foot of my bed, his expression a mask of manufactured stress. "Look, Valerie," he began, using that smooth corporate voice he reserved for pitching bad ideas. "I have an absolute crisis on my hands. The venture capital investors in Cabo are threatening to pull their funding if I do not get down there and pitch them face to face. You know how crucial this seed round is for the business. I have to board a flight right now." I stared at him through a haze of physical agony and sheer disbelief. I was 35 years old, a senior financial auditor who spent her days dismantling complex corporate fraud, and yet I could not comprehend the audacity of the man standing in front of me. Kendrick loved to play the highly successful entrepreneur for his family and his social circle. He loved the title of CEO. But I knew the reality. I was the one who funded his lifestyle. I was the silent capital behind his empty shell companies. And right now, I was the one pushing his child into the world. "My water broke 14 hours ago, Kendrick," I gasped, clutching the thin hospital blanket. "I am dilated to an 8. The doctor said the baby is coming today. You cannot leave me here alone." He let out a loud, exasperated sigh, running a perfectly manicured hand over his fade. "Stop being so dramatic, Valerie," he said, rolling his eyes. "The nurse just said you were progressing slowly. It is probably just more false alarms. You have been crying wolf all week. Brenda is on her way here anyway, so you will not be alone. I cannot let this deal fall through just to sit here and watch you breathe heavily for another 10 hours. He leaned down and pressed a quick, detached kiss to my sweaty forehead. "You need to learn how to manage your stress better, Valerie. It is not good for the baby. I will call you when I land." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, severing the last thread of respect I held for the man I had married. I was left entirely alone in the blinding white room to face the most terrifying and painful moments of my life. I pushed my son into the world with no hand to hold, guided only by the voices of the medical staff. The physical pain of childbirth was excruciating, but it paled in comparison to the cold, hollow realization that the man who had promised to protect me had abandoned me for his own ego. It was hours later when the door finally opened again. I was exhausted, my body aching in ways I did not know were possible. I expected to see a nurse, but instead my mother-in-law. Brenda strolled into the room, followed closely by my sister-in-law, Chloe. Neither of them carried flowers or balloons. Instead, they both held large iced coffees, looking as though they had just come from a casual shopping trip, rather than rushing to welcome a new life into the world. Brenda walked over to the edge of my bed, her eyes scanning my tired face with her signature blend of judgment and passive aggression. "Well," she sighed heavily, taking a slow sip of her drink, "you certainly took your time." Kendrick called me from the airport lounge, sounding absolutely exhausted. "You really do stress that boy out when he has major corporate deals on the line, Valerie. Timing is everything in business, and your timing is always so selfish." I bit my tongue, suppressing the urge to scream. Brenda had spent our entire marriage enabling Kendrick, treating him like an infallible king while belittling my demanding career. She viewed my financial independence as a threat to his manhood rather than the very foundation that kept a roof over his head. Chloe stepped forward, brushing a stray blonde hair from her designer sweater. She was married to Kendrick's older brother, Jamal, and she constantly weaponized her privilege to remind me of my place in their toxic family hierarchy. She looked around the sterile hospital room with visible distaste before turning her condescending smile on me. "You know, Valerie," Chloe chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I just do not understand why you insisted on this whole natural birth experience. It is so chaotic and messy. When I had my daughter, I scheduled a C-section perfectly. It was so civilized. Plus, it allowed Jamal to make his weekend golf tournament at the country club without any stress. You really need to learn how to manage your body better. It is just about being considerate to your husband's schedule." The sheer audacity of her microaggression hung in the air. The comparison was clear. Chloe was the golden standard, the perfect accommodating wife, while I was the overbearing, aggressive career woman who inconvenienced the men in the family. They saw my difficult labor not as a medical reality, but as a deliberate attempt to sabotage Kendrick's fictional success. I forced a tight, serene smile, refusing to give them the reaction they so desperately wanted. "I am just focusing on resting right now," I said softly, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Brenda rolled her eyes, setting her coffee cup down on my tray table. "Well, rest up. Kendrick said he needs you to approve some vendor invoices while he is in the air, so do not let your postpartum fog make you sloppy. We are going down to the cafeteria to get real food. This hospital smells like bleach." They turned and walked out, leaving their half-empty cups behind. A few moments later, my attending nurse walked in with a sympathetic smile. She checked my vitals and then reached into the pocket of my personal bag, retrieving my phone. "You might want to let your family know the good news," she whispered kindly, placing the device in my palm before leaving me to rest. The screen illuminated in the dim room. I had 3 missed calls from work and 1 unread text message from Kendrick. I swiped the screen open, expecting a generic update about his flight, or perhaps a lazy excuse for his behavior. Instead, the text read, "The warden is stuck at the hospital having the kid. Boarding the jet now, baby. 3 weeks in paradise, all expenses paid." The words burned into my retinas. He had sent the message to me by mistake, obviously intending it for someone else. Someone he called baby. Someone he was taking to Cabo while I bled on a hospital bed. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone or scream into my pillow. The exhaustion of labor vanished, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. The tears I might have shed for a broken marriage instantly evaporated. I was not just a betrayed wife. I was a senior financial auditor who dismantled corporate criminals for a living. And Kendrick had just handed me the keys to his destruction. I reached over and pulled my work laptop from my overnight bag. I ignored the dull ache in my body and balanced the computer on my knees. Kendrick believed I was blinded by love and maternal hormones. He forgot that I built the very financial architecture he used to play pretend. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed the standard joint accounts and tapped directly into the encrypted corporate accounts I had set up for him years ago for tax purposes. I ran a trace on the IP addresses and recent transaction histories. The numbers never lie, and what they told me painted a picture far more devastating than a simple affair. Kendrick had not just purchased 2 first-class tickets to Cabo for himself and a woman named Kiara whose name appeared repeatedly on payroll as his executive assistant. The financial rot went much deeper. I cross-referenced the outflows with our personal assets. My breath hitched as I uncovered a catastrophic transaction dated 3 weeks prior. Kendrick had forged my signature to take out a massive second mortgage on the commercial property I had purchased entirely with my own money long before we ever met. He had leveraged my hard-earned real estate to fund a secret life. The door to my room opened softly. The nurse walked in pushing a small, clear bassinet. She smiled warmly and gently lifted my beautiful newborn son, placing him carefully against my chest. I looked down at his tiny, perfect face, his small hands curled into fists against my hospital gown. I felt a surge of fierce protective love unlike anything I had ever known. Then I looked up from my innocent child to the glaring, irrefutable financial evidence glowing on my laptop screen. Kendrick had stolen from my past to fund his mistress, and in doing so, he had attempted to steal from my son's future. He had texted his mistress that he wanted 3 weeks in paradise. As I held my baby close and stared at the glowing numbers on the screen, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would give Kendrick his 3 weeks. And when he returned, he would find that the paradise he thought he owned had been completely liquidated. The war had begun, and I was going to ensure his permanent vacation from our lives. 2 days later, I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the suburban estate I had completely financed. The silence of the 4,000-square-foot house was deafening. My body still ached with the deep bone-deep soreness of a difficult labor, but my mind had never been sharper. I held my newborn son Caleb close to my chest, breathing in his sweet scent. He was the only pure thing in this house. Everything else was a monument to Kendrick's massive, fragile ego. I had purchased this property in an upscale Atlanta neighborhood 2 years before we even got married. Kendrick simply moved in and immediately started acting like the lord of the manor. He loved hosting lavish dinners for his friends, pouring top-shelf liquor I paid for, and soaking up their admiration. I let him do it because I loved him. I dimmed my own light to let him shine. I convinced myself that supporting his dreams was what a good wife was supposed to do. I carefully laid Caleb in his bassinet in the living room. I needed to sit down. The physical toll of childbirth was demanding my attention, but the forensic accountant in me was already mapping out a war strategy. I opened my lap and placed it on the kitchen island. I had spent the last 48 hours in the hospital, tracing every single cent Kendrick had siphoned from my accounts. The picture was grim, but it gave me all the ammunition I needed. Before I could even type in my password, the front door swung open. I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. I had never given anyone else a key to my home, but Kendrick had apparently handed them out like party favors. My mother-in-law, Brenda, strutted into the foyer, followed closely by my sister-in-law, Chloe. They did not knock. They did not announce themselves. They simply invaded my sanctuary as if they owned the place. Chloe was holding an iced matcha latte, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun that probably took an hour to perfect. She was married to Kendrick's older brother, Jamal, and she never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of her background. She came from a wealthy white family, and she navigated our African-American family dynamics with a toxic blend of condescension and weaponized fragility. Brenda walked straight past the bassinet, where her newborn grandson was sleeping, without even glancing down. She dropped her designer handbag onto my pristine kitchen counter and crossed her arms. Her face was set in a deep scowl. Chloe wandered over to the nursery door, which was propped open. She took a sip of her drink and let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "You know, Valerie," she chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I was looking at the nursery decorations you picked out. It is very modern. A bit cold and stark, do you not think? When I had my daughter, I made sure the nursery was warm and inviting and nurturing. But then again, you always had that overbearing career woman energy. It is just your nature to be so rigid and focused on aesthetics instead of warmth." I stared at her. I had literally just given birth alone 2 days ago. My body was healing. My husband was currently on a beach in Cabo with his 20-something mistress. And here was Chloe delivering racial and classist microaggressions, masked as helpful family advice. She loved playing the delicate, nurturing mother, while painting me as the aggressive, masculine provider who did not know how to be a real woman. Brenda nodded in agreement, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. "You really do need to soften up, Valerie. Kendrick is a provider. He is a visionary. He needs a soft place to land when he comes home from conquering the business world. He needs a wife, not a drill sergeant. You are always so focused on control." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Kendrick was not a visionary. He was a parasite dressed in tailored suits. But Brenda had spent her entire life enabling his narcissism. She treated him like an infallible patriarch and expected me to act as his silent, grateful subordinate. I forced my face to remain completely relaxed. I channeled every ounce of professional composure I had honed in corporate boardrooms. "I am just a little tired, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice soft and deliberately submissive. The delivery was exhausting. What brings you both by today? Brenda let out an exasperated huff. Kendrick called me this morning from Mexico. He is under an immense amount of pressure with these venture capitalists, Valerie. He is trying to secure funding to secure your family's future, and you are making it impossible for him. His corporate credit card was declined at the resort this morning. She leaned over the kitchen island, her eyes flashing with indignation. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is for a man of his stature? To be sitting at a five-star resort with major investors and have his card declined. He was humiliated. He cannot reach you because you are ignoring his calls. You need to wire $15,000 to his business account immediately so he can cover the investor dinners and the hotel expenses. Chloe nodded sympathetically, placing her hand over her heart. It really is awful, Valerie. When Jamal's card got flagged for fraud on our anniversary trip, I just sat in the hotel room and cried. I was so stressed for him. But you are just so strong. You black women are always so resilient. I could never handle managing all the finances the way you do. You just need to fix this for him so he can focus on his big deals. I looked down at my laptop screen. I knew exactly why his card was declined. I had placed a temporary security hold on it while I was still in my hospital bed. It was a minor inconvenience, just enough to make him sweat. He was not dining with venture capitalists. He was ordering room service and buying designer sunglasses for Kiara. And he had the absolute audacity to call his mother to bully his postpartum wife into funding his infidelity. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump, as if the weight of the world was simply too much for me. I looked up at Brenda with wide, apologetic eyes. I tapped into the stereotype they had assigned me and played it flawlessly. I am so sorry, Brenda, I whispered, letting my voice tremble just a fraction. My mind is just so cloudy from the delivery and the medication. The postpartum fog is really heavy today. I must have missed a security alert from the bank. You know how strict they are with international charges. It is completely my fault. I will log in right now and make sure he gets exactly what he needs. Brenda's posture relaxed immediately. Her face softened into a smug, victorious smile. She had put the unruly workhorse back in her proper place. See, Chloe, she said, gesturing toward me. This is what happens when women try to control the finances. They get overwhelmed. Just wire the money, Valerie, and then go take a nap. We are going to head out to lunch. We just came by to make sure you handled this. They did not ask to hold Caleb. They did not ask if I needed water or a meal. They picked up their bags and walked toward the front door, chatting about their lunch reservations. I will take care of it right away, I called out after them. Thank you for checking on us. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them. The lock engaged with a solid, satisfying thud. The silence returned to the house, but this time it was not oppressive. It was the sound of a clear battlefield. I dropped the tired, submissive wife routine instantly. My posture straightened. The pain in my body faded to the background, overshadowed by pure, calculated adrenaline. I pulled the laptop toward me and opened the primary banking portal. I had promised Brenda I would give Kendrick exactly what he needed, and I was a woman of my word. He needed a harsh, permanent dose of reality. I did not just block the $15,000 transfer. I initiated a catastrophic financial freeze on every single line of credit attached to his name. I revoked his authorized user access on my premium black card. I flagged his corporate American Express for severe fraudulent activity, which would lock the account for a minimum of 30 days, pending a federal review. Then I moved to our joint checking and savings accounts. With a few swift keystrokes, I drained every single cent, transferring the funds into a private, highly secure trust account, established solely in my son's name. I left exactly $5.32 in the joint account, just enough to keep it from closing automatically. I sat back and watched the confirmation screens pop up one by one. The corporate accounts were frozen. The credit lines were dead. The cash was gone. Kendrick was currently sitting at a luxury resort in Cabo San Lucas, thousands of miles away from home, with a mistress he could no longer afford and a lifestyle that had just evaporated into thin air. I looked over at the bassinet where Caleb was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm his mother was brewing. I smiled for the first time in days. The financial execution was complete. Now it was time to physically erase him from our lives. I pulled my laptop closer to the edge of the kitchen island, the glow of the screen illuminating the quiet room. Freezing his personal and corporate credit lines was merely the opening salvo. It was a tourniquet applied to a bleeding wound. Now I needed to perform the surgery. I needed to dissect the very anatomy of his financial existence. As a senior financial auditor, I spent my days unspooling complex corporate fraud for multinational conglomerates. Kendrick was a reckless amateur by comparison. He left digital fingerprints everywhere, believing his charm and my supposed blind devotion would forever shield him from scrutiny. I opened my specialized auditing software and bypassed the superficial checking accounts we shared. I needed to see the architecture of his deceit. I accessed the primary server for his venture capital firm, which was nothing more than a glorified shell company. I started pulling the general ledgers, the wire transfer histories, and the tax filings for the past 5 years. I worked with absolute precision, my keystrokes echoing in the empty house. The physical pain of my recent labor was completely eclipsed by the icy determination coursing through my veins. Caleb shifted in his bassinet, letting out a soft sigh, and I glanced over at him. Every fraudulent document I uncovered, every stolen dollar I traced, was a threat to my black son's future. I was not just a woman scorned. I was a mother protecting her child from a predator. As I dug deeper into the corporate inflows, a glaring discrepancy immediately caught my attention. Kendrick had been maintaining an illusion of massive liquid capital, projecting the image of a highly successful entrepreneur. I knew he was siphoning from my commercial property, but the numbers on the screen told a much darker story. The math did not align. There were massive influxes of cash hitting his shell accounts at the end of every quarter, millions of dollars that did not originate from my assets. I traced the routing numbers attached to these massive deposits. My breath caught in my throat as the source institution populated on the screen. The funds were not coming from anonymous investors. They were coming from Brenda. I opened a secondary window and initiated a deep dive into my mother-in-law's financial portfolio. Kendrick had convinced her to grant him full power of attorney 2 years ago, claiming he was going to aggressively manage her retirement portfolio and triple her returns. Brenda had agreed without hesitation, completely blinded by her unwavering worship of her golden boy. She had handed him the keys to her entire life savings. The digital ledger painted a horrifying picture. Kendrick had not invested a single cent of her money. He had been systematically liquidating her pension funds, her mutual funds, and the life insurance payout from his late father. He had drained her accounts with terrifying efficiency, moving the capital through a series of dummy corporations to wash the origin before dropping it into his own slush fund. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. Just an hour ago, Brenda had stood in my kitchen demanding I wire $15,000 to save her son from embarrassment. She had lectured me on how to be a supportive, submissive wife. She had treated me like a broken ATM while fiercely defending the very man who had just left her completely and utterly destitute. She was 65 years old, and her beloved son had bankrupted her. She had nothing left but the designer handbag sitting on her arm. The sickness in my stomach was quickly replaced by a cold, clinical focus. If he was willing to destroy his own mother, who else was he bleeding dry? I returned to the transaction logs, sorting the data by recurring external transfers. Another pattern emerged. Every month for the past 3 years, exactly $8,000 had been wired into Kendrick's offshore holding account. The source account was registered to a joint trust fund. I ran the names attached to the trust: Jamal and Chloe. It was the college savings account for their 2 young children. Jamal was Kendrick's older brother, a hard-working man who trusted his charismatic younger sibling implicitly. Kendrick had pitched Jamal a guaranteed high-yield investment strategy for his children's education. Jamal had signed the paperwork authorizing Kendrick as the primary broker. But Kendrick had taken it a step further. I pulled up the authorization forms and zoomed in on Jamal's signature. It was a blatant, sloppy forgery. Kendrick had falsified legal documents to bypass the withdrawal limits, draining his own nieces' and nephews' college funds to zero. I thought about Chloe standing in my nursery just moments ago, sipping her iced latte and delivering her thinly veiled racist microaggressions. She had mocked my career woman energy and bragged about her scheduled C-section and her husband's golf tournaments. She paraded her white privilege and her generational wealth around our family gatherings, like a weapon always making sure I knew I was an outsider. She thought she was untouchable, securely elevated above the messy realities of our lives. She had no idea that the brother-in-law she constantly defended had liquidated her children's entire future. Her pristine, carefully curated suburban life was currently standing on a financial sinkhole. Kendrick had robbed them blind. I rubbed my temples, feeling a massive headache forming behind my eyes. The sheer scale of his betrayal was suffocating. He had decimated his entire family. But where had all the money gone? The trips to Cabo and the designer suits could not account for millions of missing dollars. I initiated a global trace on the offshore account, where he had been funneling Brenda and Jamal's money. The capital did not stay in the Caymans for long. It was immediately routed back into the United States, heavily laundered and deposited into a boutique real estate holding firm based in downtown Atlanta. I hacked into the public property records database and cross-referenced the holding firm's recent acquisitions. There it was. A luxury penthouse condominium located in one of the most exclusive high-rises in the city. The purchase price was $2.5 million paid entirely in cash. I pulled the deed of trust. The property was not registered under Kendrick's name. It was not registered under his corporation. The deed was registered to Kiara, his 24-year-old mistress, the woman he claimed was his executive assistant. I stared at the name printed on the digital document, letting the absolute absurdity of the situation wash over me. Kendrick had not just taken Kiara on a 3-week vacation to Mexico. He had bought her a $2.5 million luxury penthouse. He had furnished her life using his mother's retirement savings and his brother's college funds. He had stolen the financial security of his entire family to play sugar daddy to a woman 13 years his junior. He had traded his family's blood and sweat for an illusion of power. I did not feel heartbroken. I felt a dangerous, exhilarating sense of power. Kendrick had handed me the absolute destruction of his entire world on a silver platter. All I had to do was serve it. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously compiling the evidence. I downloaded every single digital ledger, every forged authorization form, every time-stamped wire transfer, and the deed to Kiara's penthouse. I organized the documents into a timeline that told an irrefutable story of predatory corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. I created multiple encrypted backups, saving them to secure cloud servers and external hard drives. I then printed the most damning documents: the forged signature draining Jamal's account, the zero balance statement from Brenda's retirement portfolio, the property deed with Kiara's name highlighted in bold ink. I placed these physical copies into a thick, heavy red folder. This folder was no longer just divorce evidence. It was a loaded weapon. I closed my laptop and stretched my aching back. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across my empty kitchen. The financial audit was complete. I had successfully severed his access to my capital and uncovered the full extent of his familial treason. He was a dead man walking, he just did not know it yet. I walked over to the bassinet and gently scooped Caleb into my arms, holding his warm little body against my chest. He cooed softly, nuzzling into my neck. I kissed the top of his head, making him a silent promise. His father would never have the opportunity to steal from him. The digital erasure was finished. Kendrick had no money, no credit, and no leverage. Now it was time for the physical erasure. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for an elite discreet relocation service I had vetted months ago for corporate clients. They specialized in rapid overnight moves. The war had shifted from the digital realm to the physical. Over the next 2 weeks, I was going to pack up this entire massive house, sell every luxury car in the driveway, and vanish into thin air. By the time Kendrick returned from his tropical paradise, he would find nothing but ghosts. The digital war was won, but the physical dismantling of Kendrick's kingdom required a different kind of precision. It was day 3 of his tropical getaway. The red folder containing the absolute proof of his financial crimes against his family was locked safely in my briefcase. I had exactly 17 days left to execute the most comprehensive eviction of my life. Kendrick loved his toys. Sitting in the driveway were his absolute pride and joy, a custom black Mercedes G-Wagon, and a sleek Porsche 911. He drove them around Atlanta, like they were symbols of his business acumen. He loved throwing the keys to the valets at high-end steakhouses, making sure everyone saw him. But like everything else in his life, those cars were a carefully constructed illusion. My name and my pristine credit score were the only things on the titles. He was not even a co-signer. I picked up my phone and called a high-end automotive liquidator I had met during a previous corporate audit. Because I was the sole legal owner, the process was incredibly efficient. Within 48 hours, 2 massive flatbed trucks pulled into my suburban neighborhood. I stood on the front porch holding Caleb wrapped in a soft blanket and watched as the operators secured the vehicles. The heavy chains clanked against the metal as they hauled away the very symbols of Kendrick's fake masculinity. The liquidator wired the funds directly into the newly established trust account for my son. Kendrick was currently lounging on a beach chair in Cabo buying expensive drinks for Kiara, unaware that he would be walking out of the airport terminal to an empty parking space. But getting rid of the cars was just the beginning. I could not stay in this house. This sprawling 4,000-square-foot monument to a dead marriage was tainted. It was too accessible to Brenda and Chloe, who lived just a few miles away and felt entitled to drop by whenever they pleased. I needed a fortress where they could never reach me or my child. Using my extensive professional network, I contacted a premier commercial real estate broker. I explained that I needed high-level security and absolute anonymity. I established a blind corporate LLC ensuring my name would never appear on any public registry or lease agreement. Within 3 days, I signed the paperwork for a breathtaking ultra-secure penthouse in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The building featured private elevator access, 24-hour armed concierge security, and biometric scanners. Most importantly, it was a place where Kendrick and his toxic enablers would never be able to find me. I paid for a full year up front in cash using the funds I had legally secured from the liquidation of my own assets. The most logistically challenging phase was the physical extraction. I needed to empty a massive estate right under the noses of his family without triggering a single alarm. I could not risk a noisy weekend move that might catch the attention of a nosy neighbor who would immediately call Brenda. I hired a specialized stealth relocation firm that catered to high-profile executives and celebrities. They understood the assignment perfectly. They operated with absolute discretion, using unmarked trucks and working during specific hours when the neighborhood was quietest. Over the next week, they meticulously dismantled my entire life piece by piece. They did not just pack my clothes and Caleb's nursery items. I instructed the foreman to take everything I had ever paid for, which meant they took absolutely everything. The imported Italian leather sectionals, the massive flat-screen televisions, the custom dining table where Kendrick loved to hold court, the high-end kitchen appliances, even the silverware in the drawers. I watched the physical representation of our fraudulent marriage being wrapped in moving blankets and carried out the door. I spent days 15 through 19 managing the transition from the sanctuary of my new penthouse. I set up my home office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, feeling a profound sense of peace as I rocked Caleb to sleep. I gave the security team at my new building a strict blacklist, including photos of Kendrick, Brenda, Jamal, and Chloe. I was officially a ghost. Meanwhile, Kendrick was still trying to maintain his facade from Mexico. He sent me sporadic text messages complaining about his credit cards, declining at luxury boutiques, blaming bank errors, and demanding I fix the issue immediately. I replied with brief, generic-sounding apologies, playing the role of the overwhelmed new mother. I assured him the bank was investigating the fraud alert and told him to just be patient. I kept him pacified and distracted by the sun and the sand, while I pulled the rug completely out from under his entire existence. It is day 20. I drove back to the suburban house for one final walkthrough. I stepped through the front door, and the silence was absolute. The house was cavernous, its sheer size magnified by the complete absence of life. My heels clicked against the bare hardwood floors, the sound echoing off the empty walls. The moving crew had done an exceptional job. The house was stripped down to the bare drywall. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no pictures on the walls. The only thing remaining in the entire 4,000-square-foot property was the massive marble kitchen island, because it was bolted directly to the foundation. I walked over to the cold stone surface, placing my designer handbag down. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a single crisp white envelope. Inside that envelope was a copy of the finalized divorce filing and emergency temporary restraining order, granting me full physical custody of Caleb, and a printed screenshot of the accidental text message he had sent me from the hospital delivery room. I placed the envelope perfectly in the center of the bare marble island, making sure it was the very first thing he would see when he walked into the empty room. I pulled out my phone and opened the flight tracker application. The little green airplane icon was moving steadily across the map. Kendrick's flight from Cabo San Lucas was currently in the air. He was scheduled to land at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in exactly 12 hours. He was coming home expecting to find his submissive wife, his brand new son, his luxury cars, and his comfortable life waiting for him. I turned around and walked toward the foyer. I stepped out onto the front porch, breathing in the warm evening air. I pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind me, listening to the deadbolt slide into place. I locked the door for the very last time and walked to my waiting car, ready to watch his world burn. I sat in the plush leather chair of my new downtown penthouse, overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. My newborn son Caleb was asleep in his crib safe, behind reinforced steel doors and biometric scanners. At that exact moment, 30,000 feet in the air, my husband Kendrick was likely sipping complimentary champagne in first class, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire kingdom had already fallen. I had paid a private investigator a very generous fee to monitor Kendrick's arrival at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. I did not want to miss a single second of his crumbling reality. The investigator sent me real-time text updates, painting a vivid picture of the scene. Kendrick stepped off the plane looking deeply tanned and radiating an unearned, arrogant energy. He was wearing a fresh linen shirt he had likely purchased with the last few dollars on his dwindling credit limit before my financial freeze took full effect. He did not look like a man who had just rushed back from a high-stakes venture capital meeting. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 3 weeks lounging on a yacht in Cabo San Lucas with his 24-year-old mistress. And because Kendrick was a malignant narcissist who lived entirely for social media validation, he did not come back to Atlanta alone. I had actually hired a freelance videographer to meet him at the arrivals terminal. He wanted to document his triumphant return. I could practically hear the voiceover he had planned in his head. The dedicated entrepreneur sacrificing his precious time to secure his family's financial future, rushing straight from the tarmac to the maternity ward to hold his newborn son. I was going to use our child as a prop to boost his online engagement and impress his network of fake business gurus. He climbed into the back of a luxury black car, the videographer tracking his every move, capturing his perfectly manufactured expression of anxious excitement. He directed the driver to take him straight to the hospital where he had left me in blinding physical agony 3 weeks prior. He did not bother checking his banking apps. He did not try to call me because he assumed I was still sitting in our suburban house playing the role of the exhausted, overwhelmed new mother, waiting patiently for her king to return. He expected me to be weak, compliant, and desperate for his attention. The investigator followed them to the hospital and later provided me with the full, detailed account of what unfolded in that maternity ward lobby. I also received a highly entertaining phone call from Nurse Davis, the no-nonsense head nurse, who had held my hand while I pushed my baby into the world. I had given her a brief, very sanitized warning about my husband's impending arrival before I checked out of the hospital. I told her he might show up looking for me, and that I did not want him to have access to any of my new contact information. Kendrick strutted through the automatic sliding doors of the maternity ward like he owned the building. The videographer was walking backwards in front of him, recording his heroic march toward the front desk. Kendrick leaned against the high counter, flashing his signature $1 million smile at the nursing staff. "I am Kendrick," he announced, projecting his voice so the microphone would pick it up perfectly. "I am here to see my wife Valerie and my new baby boy. I just flew in from a major corporate acquisition in Mexico and I need to see them immediately." Nurse Davis, a veteran of the maternity ward, who had seen every type of deadbeat father imaginable, did not even blink. She looked at his deep tropical tan. She looked at the expensive camera lens pointed directly at her face. Then she looked down at her computer terminal, typing my name into the system just to humor him. The silence in the lobby stretched on. Kendrick tapped his fingers on the counter, performing his impatience for the camera. He looked around, expecting nurses to rush forward and escort the wealthy CEO to his weeping, grateful wife. Finally, Nurse Davis looked back up, her expression an absolute mask of professional contempt. She did not lower her voice to spare his feelings. "Sir, your wife is not here," she stated clearly. "She was discharged 3 weeks ago. You missed the birth." The smile slid off Kendrick's face like water off glass. The videographer kept rolling, capturing the exact moment his carefully curated reality fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. "What are you talking about?" Kendrick demanded, his voice losing its smooth corporate polish and pitching upward in panic. "She just had the baby. My mother told me she was resting at the house, but she had follow-up appointments here today. She has to be here." "I do not know what your mother told you, sir," Nurse Davis replied, her voice carrying across the quiet waiting area, drawing the attention of several other expecting families. "But Valerie delivered a healthy baby boy 20 days ago. She was discharged under standard procedure 48 hours later. If you are looking for your family, I suggest you check your own home instead of bringing a camera crew into my hospital." Kendrick stumbled backward, running a hand over his face. The investigator noted that Kendrick pulled out his phone, frantically checking the dates in his messages. He had been so entirely consumed by his luxury vacation, so wrapped up in the illusion of his own grandeur and his affair with Kiara, that he had lost complete track of time. He had assumed I would be trapped in a cycle of postpartum recovery, unable to make any sudden moves. I thought he had endless time to play his games before returning to play the family man. He shoved the videographer's camera away, his panic finally breaking through the heavy layers of his narcissism. "Turn that off," he snapped, his voice echoing off the hospital walls. He stormed out of the lobby, the polished executive persona entirely replaced by the frantic energy of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on quicksand. He practically sprinted back to the black car, leaving the confused videographer jogging to keep up. Sitting in my secure penthouse, I took a slow sip of my hot herbal tea. I spent a few moments reflecting on how we had reached this spectacular point of destruction. I thought about how long I had played the fool to protect his pride. I thought about the countless times I had covered his bank overdrafts, paid off his mysterious business loans, and smiled politely at family dinners, while Brenda praised his non-existent financial genius. I had financed his entire existence, from the clothes on his back to the food on his plate. And in return, he had abandoned me during the most vulnerable physical experience a woman can endure. He had traded the birth of his black son for cheap tequila and a mistress who was only using him for the money he was actively stealing from his own mother and brother. He had built a house of cards on top of my credit score, and now the wind was blowing at hurricane force. I closed my eyes and pictured the suburban house he was currently speeding toward. I had hired the absolute best stealth relocation team in Atlanta. They had left nothing behind but dust and echoes. Even the smart bulbs, the custom window treatments, and the toilet paper holders I had purchased were gone. I imagined him pulling into the driveway. He would notice the missing custom G-Wagon first, then the Porsche. He would probably assume I had them serviced or moved to a different location. He would rationalize it, because men like Kendrick always rationalize their surroundings to fit their inflated ego. He would walk up to that heavy mahogany front door, expecting to use his key to enter his castle. He would expect his Italian leather sofas, his fully stocked premium bar, and his submissive wife waiting to apologize for causing a scene. But reality was a relentless force, and it was waiting for him in the dark. I looked over at Caleb, sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. My son would never know a life where his father's toxic presence dictated his mother's worth. I was breaking generational curses with surgical precision and severe financial consequences. The digital trap had already been sprung. The physical trap was currently waiting with its jaws wide open. Now all I had to do was wait for the explosion to reach my phone. My phone vibrated against the sleek glass of my new coffee table, right on cue. It was a push notification from the discreet security cameras I had instructed the relocation team to leave hidden around the perimeter of the suburban estate. The digital trap was set, but the physical reality of his destruction was about to be broadcast directly to my screen in high definition. I leaned back into my chair and tapped the notification bringing up the live video feed. The luxury black car pulled into the driveway and idled for a moment. Kendrick stepped out, slamming the door behind him. He stood on the concrete for a long few seconds, staring blankly at the empty spaces where his custom Mercedes and Porsche usually sat. Through the camera lens, I watched his brow furrow. He pulled out his phone, probably checking his messages to see if I had taken them in for detailing. When he saw no new messages from me, he shoved the phone back into his pocket and marched up the walkway. His stride was heavy, angry. He was a man who felt entitled to a seamless life, and any deviation from his comfort provoked an immediate temper tantrum. He reached the heavy mahogany front door and pulled his keys from his pocket. He slid the key into the deadbolt and tried to turn it. The lock did not yield. He pulled the key out, inspected it, and jammed it back into the cylinder, twisting his wrist with obvious force. The newly installed commercial-grade lock remained entirely unbothered. I watched him rattle the heavy door handle, pulling and pushing with his entire body weight. His deep tropical tan seemed to pale slightly under the porch light. The polished executive persona was slipping away, revealing the frantic, unhinged reality of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the outside of his own life. Kendrick paced back and forth across the front porch, muttering to himself. He jogged around the side of the house toward the backyard patio. I switched the camera feed on my tablet, tracking his movement to the rear of the property. He expected to find the patio furniture, the expensive grill, and the potted plants I used to tend on the weekends. Instead, he found a barren concrete slab. He marched up to the rear French doors and cupped his hands over his face, peering through the glass. The camera captured the exact second the blood drained from his face completely. He did not bother looking for a hidden spare key. Panic took over completely. He grabbed a heavy decorative landscape stone from the edge of the garden and hurled it directly at the glass pane. The reinforced glass shattered inward with a violent crash. He reached his arm carefully through the jagged hole, unlocked the latch, and pushed the door open. I turned up the volume on my tablet, allowing the ambient audio from the indoor security cameras to fill my quiet penthouse. I wanted to hear every single footstep. Kendrick stepped into the living room, and the sheer acoustic emptiness of the house hit him instantly. Without the imported Italian leather sofas, the heavy custom rugs, and the massive bookshelves to absorb the sound, his heavy breathing echoed off the bare drywall. He walked slowly into the center of the room, turning in a slow circle. The space was completely hollow. There were no indentations on the carpet, no lingering smell of home-cooked meals, no television mounted on the wall. It looked exactly like a vacant model home waiting for a staging company. "Valerie," he yelled out, his voice cracking and bouncing off the empty walls. "Valerie, where are you?" He started running. The heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes pounded against the hardwood floors as he sprinted up the grand staircase. I switched the feed to the upstairs hallway. He burst into the master bedroom. The custom walk-in closet, where he used to meticulously arrange his tailored suits and designer sneakers, was stripped down to the bare wooden shelves. He threw open the bathroom doors, finding no towels, no toiletries, no trace that anyone had ever lived there. He scrambled down this hallway and threw open the door to Caleb's nursery. He stood paralyzed in the doorway. The crib was gone. The changing table was gone. The rocking chair where I had planned to spend countless nights holding our son was gone. The room was just 4 painted walls and empty air. I was hyperventilating now. The camera caught him running his hands over his head, gripping his hair as the magnitude of his absolute erasure settled into his bones. He had assumed I was a weak postpartum woman, easily manipulated and distracted. He had severely underestimated the meticulous, ruthless efficiency of a senior financial auditor protecting her child. Kendrick stumbled back down the stairs, his legs looking heavy and uncoordinated. He practically crawled into the massive kitchen, and there, sitting perfectly in the center of the bolted-down marble kitchen island, was the crisp white envelope. It was the only object left in a 4,000-square-foot house. He approached the island like a man approaching a bomb. His hands were trembling so violently that he struggled to slide his finger under the flap. He tore the envelope open and dumped the contents onto the cold stone surface. The first document he unfolded was the emergency temporary restraining order. I had an exceptional legal team, and the evidence of his financial theft, combined with his abandonment during a medical event, was more than enough for a judge to grant me full physical and legal custody of Caleb pending a permanent hearing. The thick black ink declared that Kendrick was legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me or our son. I tossed it aside, breathing heavily, and picked up the next document. It was the finalized divorce filing, citing irreconcilable differences and egregious financial misconduct. I had filed it the exact day he posted a photo of his beachfront cocktail on his private social media account. But the final piece of paper was the true masterpiece. It was a high-resolution printed screenshot of the text message he had sent me from the hospital delivery room. The words were printed in bold font. "The warden is stuck at the hospital having the kid. Boarding the jet now, baby. 3 weeks in paradise, all expenses paid." I watched him stare at the piece of paper. He dropped it onto the marble island as if it had physically burned his hands. He took 2 steps backward, hitting the kitchen counter and sliding down until he was sitting on the bare floor. He buried his face in his hands. He was completely alone, surrounded by the echoing silence of his own making. He had traded his loyal wife and his newborn son for 3 weeks of cheap thrills, and now he was sitting in the wreckage. But Kendrick was a survivor of the most parasitic kind. He was a man who always believed he had a safety net. He always assumed he could buy his way out of a problem or manipulate someone else into saving him. I knew exactly what his next move would be. He would try to access the millions of dollars he had systematically siphoned from his mother Brenda and his brother Jamal. He would try to reach the offshore accounts he had used to purchase the luxury penthouse for his mistress Kiara. I thought he had a massive hidden war chest waiting to fund his legal defense and secure his new life. Through the camera feed, I watched him pull his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. He swiped frantically across the screen, dialing the international number for his offshore private banker. He brought the phone to his ear, his eyes darting around the empty kitchen like a trapped animal looking for an exit. I leaned forward in my chair, unable to look away from the screen. I knew the exact protocol of the offshore institution he used. I had audited their banking structures before. Since I had submitted the anonymous detailed dossier of his wire fraud and corporate embezzlement directly to the federal authorities, the offshore bank would have automatically triggered a massive internal security protocol. Through the quiet audio feed of the empty house, I heard the faint, tinny sound of the automated banking voice emanating from his phone speaker. Kendrick pressed the buttons on his keypad, entering his secure account number and his specialized PIN. He held his breath, waiting for the automated system to confirm the millions of dollars he thought he had hidden away from me. The mechanical automated voice echoed softly in the cavernous room, delivering the final fatal blow to Kendrick's entire existence. "Your current available balance is $0.00. Please hold for a fraud prevention specialist." After the automated system informed Kendrick that his offshore accounts held a balance of 0, the reality of his complete financial ruin finally shattered his delusions. He did not call the police, because a man with his extensive history of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement avoids law enforcement at all costs. Instead, he ran to the only place he had ever found unconditional enabling shelter. I received a text from my private investigator confirming that Kendrick had practically flown out of our empty suburban driveway. He drove his rented economy car straight to Brenda's sprawling brick house in Buckhead. I knew exactly what play he was going to run. When a narcissist loses control of their victim, they immediately attempt to control the narrative surrounding the victim. Kendrick burst through his mother's front door, wearing the mask of a devastated, terrified husband. He collapsed into the nearest chair and began spinning a frantic, elaborate web of lies. He told Brenda and Jamal that I had suffered a catastrophic postpartum psychotic break. He wept dry tears, claiming he had rushed home from a grueling business trip only to find his home ransacked and his newborn son abducted by an unhinged woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. I went a step further, insisting I had drained his hard-earned business capital to fund my manic escape, leaving him totally destitute. Brenda absorbed his every word without a single ounce of hesitation or critical thought. She had spent decades casting me as the cold, calculating villain in Kendrick's life, so the idea that I had finally lost my mind fit perfectly into her twisted worldview. She immediately went into full crisis management mode, wrapping her arms around her grown son and cooing over him like an injured child. She validated his lies, soothing his bruised ego, and promising him they would hunt me down and make me pay for destroying his life. She did not stop to ask why a successful businessman had zero backup funds or why his corporate credit cards were universally declined. She only cared about protecting her golden boy. Chloe was sitting in Brenda's living room sipping a glass of afternoon wine when Kendrick arrived. She listened to his fabricated tragedy and saw an immediate opportunity to center herself in the drama. Chloe fancied herself a prominent local lifestyle influencer, constantly curating a pristine image of wealth and traditional family values for her online audience. To Chloe, I had always been an intimidating presence. I was a highly educated, financially independent Black woman who refused to shrink herself to make Chloe comfortable. This was her chance to finally cut me down to size. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing continuously, with notifications from former colleagues, acquaintances, and distant relatives. Chloe had taken Kendrick's lies and weaponized her digital platform. I sat in the quiet safety of my downtown penthouse, holding a sleeping Caleb against my chest, and opened the live video she had just posted across all her social media channels. I watched the footage with a cold, clinical detachment. Chloe sat in Brenda's perfectly decorated parlor wearing a soft, oversized sweater and minimal makeup to appear appropriately distressed. She looked directly into the camera and squeezed out a steady stream of manipulative crocodile tears. She pleaded with the Atlanta community to help locate her missing newborn nephew. But it was the language she used that revealed her true venom. Chloe expertly deployed a series of coded microaggressions designed to assassinate my character. She did not just call me a concerned mother going through a hard time. She described me as an unstable, erratic, and dangerous woman who had suffered a severe mental snap. She told her thousands of followers that the family was terrified for the baby's safety, emphasizing my aggressive, career-driven nature as proof that I lacked maternal instincts. It was a masterclass in weaponized fragility. She used her tears and her privilege to paint a target on my back, framing me as a volatile threat who had violently disrupted their peaceful family. She asked her followers to contact the authorities if they saw me effectively trying to crowdsource a manhunt based entirely on Kendrick's bruised ego and his desperate need to cover up his own financial crimes. The video gained immediate traction. The comments section flooded with strangers offering prayers for Kendrick, demanding justice for the missing baby, and calling me a monster who deserved to be locked away. They were building a public consensus convicting me in the court of public opinion before I had even spoken a single word in my own defense. I did not panic. I did not log on to my own accounts to argue with strangers or defend my sanity. Arguing with a smear campaign only gives it oxygen. Instead, I calmly screen recorded the entire broadcast and downloaded the comment threads, saving them directly to the encrypted red folder on my hard drive. Chloe thought she was destroying my reputation. In reality, she was just handing my legal team a pristine open and shut case for public defamation and libel. I forwarded the video link directly to my managing partners at the accounting firm, along with a brief, highly professional email outlining that I was currently experiencing targeted harassment from my estranged husband and his family. As a senior auditor, my firm knew my character perfectly. They knew my mental health was pristine, and they were fully aware that I was a victim of financial abuse, not the perpetrator. I requested that building security be put on high alert. Kendrick was not satisfied with just winning the internet. His narcissistic rage demanded blood. He knew that outside of my son, the thing I valued most in this world was my career. I was a senior partner track auditor at one of the most prestigious accounting firms in the state. My entire professional identity was built on a foundation of absolute integrity, financial ethics, and unshakable credibility. Kendrick deduced that if he could march into my firm and accuse me of grand theft and corporate embezzlement in front of my managing partners, he could strip away my power. He believed that if I lost my job, I would lose the capital necessary to fight him in court. He thought destroying my livelihood would force me to crawl back to him, hand over the money I had secured, and beg for his mercy. It was the ultimate maneuver of a desperate weak man trying to regain dominance over a woman who had outsmarted him. My investigator sent me a final crucial update for the afternoon. Kendrick, Brenda, and Chloe were currently marching out of the Buckhead estate and piling into Brenda's luxury SUV. They were dressed with absolute intention, looking like a unified front of concerned righteous family members, preparing to stage a dramatic intervention. Their destination was already locked into the GPS. They were heading straight for my corporate headquarters in the financial district. Kendrick intended to stride into the polished marble lobby of my firm, flanked by his weeping mother and his outraged sister-in-law, to publicly humiliate me in front of my peers. He was planning to demand my immediate termination, insisting I was a thief who had robbed her own husband blind. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the traffic weave through the downtown streets. They thought they were orchestrating a brilliant ambush. They thought they held all the cards and were about to back me into a corner I could never escape. They had no idea I had been anticipating this exact move for weeks, and I had already prepared a reception they would never forget. The ground floor lobby of my accounting firm is a cathedral of glass and imported Italian marble. It is a massive cavernous space designed to intimidate. It is a fortress of financial power, where billion-dollar corporate mergers are negotiated and high-level audits are finalized. It is absolutely not the place to stage a reality television-style family meltdown. But my husband Kendrick and his enablers had always lacked a fundamental sense of self-awareness. I stood in the polished chrome elevator as it descended smoothly from the 50th floor. I was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, my hair pulled back perfectly, my posture unyielding. Beside me stood two off-duty police officers who worked as our executive corporate security team. I had briefed them on the situation 10 minutes prior. I explained that an estranged, highly volatile individual was on his way to the building and that I needed a physical barrier to prevent any sudden aggressive movements. They flanked me like silent sentinels, their expressions deadly serious. Through the towering front windows of the lobby, I watched Brenda's luxury SUV jump the curb outside the main entrance. They did not even bother to park legally. Kendrick practically kicked his door open, marching toward the revolving glass doors with aggressive, chaotic energy. Brenda followed close behind him, clutching her designer purse like a weapon. My sister-in-law Chloe brought up the rear, holding her phone up and recording the entire expedition for her social media followers. They moved like a righteous mob ready to execute a public stoning. The elevator chimed and the metallic doors slid open. I stepped out into the expansive lobby just as Kendrick breached the security turnstiles. He spotted me instantly. His eyes were wide and frantic, stripped of their usual charming veneer. He pointed a finger directly at my chest, his voice echoing loudly off the marble walls, and drawing the immediate attention of dozens of wealthy clients and suited professionals. "There she is!" Kendrick yelled, his voice cracking with desperate rage. "That is the thief! I want to speak to the managing partners of this firm right now. She stole my son. She emptied my corporate accounts. You have a criminal working in your building, and I demand she be terminated immediately." He tried to storm past the reception desk, but my security detail stepped forward instantly, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits and broad shoulders between us. Kendrick hit the invisible boundary and stumbled back, his chest heaving. Brenda rushed to his side, placing a protective hand on his back. She glared at me with absolute venom, weaponizing her age and her fake grandmotherly concern for the audience of shocked bystanders. "Look at her!" Brenda screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Look at this cold, heartless woman. You are having a severe psychotic break, Valerie. You are sick in the head. You kidnapped my newborn grandson, and you robbed my son blind while he was trying to provide for your family. Where is the baby? Where did you hide him, you crazy woman? Tell me where my grandson is before I have you thrown in a psychiatric ward." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or break my calm professional demeanor. I simply stood there holding a thick, heavy red folder in my hands. The contrast between my absolute stillness and their frantic screaming only made them look more unhinged to the surrounding corporate crowd. My managing partner, a highly respected 60-year-old man named Richard, stepped out from behind the reception desk. He had received my email containing the video of Chloe's smear campaign. He knew my character, my financial ethics, and my flawless professional record. He crossed his arms and looked at Kendrick with profound disgust. Sir Richard said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "You are trespassing in a private corporate facility. Valerie is a senior auditor and a valued leader at this firm. I strongly suggest you lower your voice and exit the premises before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace." Kendrick was completely delusional. He truly believed that his loud, aggressive charisma could override facts. He thought he could walk into a top-tier financial institution and demand a senior auditor be fired on the spot, without a single shred of proof, simply because his ego was bruised. "She embezzled from my company." Kendrick shouted at Richard, desperately trying to assert dominance over a man who wielded real power. "She is a fraud. She is dangerous." That was when Chloe decided it was her turn to perform. She pushed her way to the front, holding her phone up to capture the drama. She was relying entirely on her white privilege, expecting the corporate crowd to automatically side with the delicate, weeping white woman over the composed black woman standing silently in front of her. She squeezed out fresh tears, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. "Valerie, this is completely unacceptable," Chloe cried, wiping her eyes for the camera. "You are acting incredibly aggressive right now. You are unstable. We all know you never really fit into this family with your masculine, domineering attitude, but taking a newborn baby into hiding is too much. You are subjecting that innocent child to a dangerous ghetto environment." She lowered her phone slightly, making sure everyone in the lobby could hear her next threat. "I have already spoken to my followers, and I am contacting Child Protective Services right now," Chloe declared, her voice dripping with self-righteous poison. "That baby needs institutional intervention. He needs to be in a stable, nurturing, traditional environment with a real mother, not an unhinged career woman who steals from her own husband. I am calling the authorities to have him removed from your custody today." The absolute audacity of her words hung in the air. She was standing in the lobby of a billionaire dollar firm, threatening to call state authorities to remove my black son from my care, citing a ghetto environment simply because I had outsmarted her financially abusive brother-in-law. She thought she held the ultimate trump card. She thought the threat of the legal system would make me crumble, beg for forgiveness, and hand Kendrick back the money he had stolen. I let her finish her performance. I let the silence stretch out, allowing her racist, classist microaggressions to fully register with the horrified professionals watching the spectacle. Then I finally moved. I stepped smoothly around my security detail, closing the distance between myself and the toxic trio. Kendrick flinched, instinctively stepping backward. Brenda braced herself, expecting me to yell back. Chloe held her ground, lifting her chin defiantly, phone still clutched in her hand, ready to dial the authorities. I did not yell. I did not scowl. I looked at Chloe with an expression of absolute lethal calm. I lifted the thick red folder, extending my arm to hand it directly to her. "Before you dial CPS, Chloe, I suggest you call Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly leveled, carrying clearly across the quiet marble lobby. "Kendrick utilized your children's college fund to purchase his mistress a G-Wagon." Chloe stood frozen, her manicured hand hovering over the thick red folder I had just extended toward her. The threat she had just levied against my child hung in the air, suddenly stripped of all its power. She snatched the folder from my grasp, her perfectly glossed lips pressed into a thin, tight line of indignation. She expected to find fabricated spreadsheets or petty divorce demands. She did not expect the meticulous, unyielding architecture of a federal financial audit staring back at her. I watched her flip open the heavy cardstock cover. The corporate crowd in the lobby seemed to hold its collective breath. My security detail remained perfectly still, allowing the execution to proceed. Chloe's eyes darted across the topmost document. It was a high-resolution copy of the wire transfer authorization form generated by the boutique automotive dealership in Midtown Atlanta. The routing number listed as the source of the funds belonged to a joint trust account. Below that was a copy of the official account ledger. It clearly displayed a massive withdrawal. A withdrawal that left the college savings account for her two young children with a balance of absolutely zero. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear a sudden blur from her vision. But the numbers were absolute. She turned the page, her hands beginning to tremble so violently that the heavy paper audibly rattled. The next document was the signature page of the withdrawal authorization. It featured Jamal's signature, or rather it featured a blatant sloppy forgery of her husband's signature executed by his younger brother. I watched the exact moment the delusion of her untouchable suburban privilege evaporated. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a stark, sickly white. She looked up from the documents and turned her gaze toward Kendrick. The artificial sweetness she always used to navigate our family dynamics vanished, completely replaced by raw, unadulterated terror and rage. Kendrick took a small step backward. He raised his hands, palms outward, adopting the posture of a man trying to calm a cornered animal. "Chloe," he stammered, his voice stripped of all its resonant confidence. "Do not listen to her. That is fabricated. Valerie is trying to manipulate you because she is sick." Brenda, who had been watching this exchange with growing impatience, snatched the folder right out of Chloe's trembling hands. Brenda was a woman who had spent her entire adult life shielding Kendrick from the consequences of his own actions. She operated under the fundamental belief that I was the villain in every scenario. She aggressively flipped through the stack of papers, fully intending to tear my evidence apart and defend her golden son. Then she reached the third section of the dossier. I had placed the documents relating to her financial portfolio right behind Chloe's. Brenda's eyes traced the bold headers of the statements pulled directly from her primary retirement accounts. She saw the systematic liquidations. She saw the mutual funds she had spent 40 years building drained to pennies. She saw the life insurance payout from her late husband transferred through a series of anonymous shell corporations. Brenda let out a sound that I had never heard before. It was not a scream or a yell. It was a hollow, guttural gasp, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from her lungs. The red folder slipped from her grasp, the printed documents fluttering to the polished marble floor of the lobby like dead leaves. She looked at the man she had elevated above all others. She had treated him like an infallible king, demanding that everyone else bow to his greatness. She had demanded I submit to him to cater to his fragile ego and to fund his lavish lifestyle. Now she was staring at the man who had just left her completely destitute at 65 years old. "Kendrick," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling so severely she could barely form the words. "Tell me this is a lie. Tell me my pension is still there. Tell me you did not take your father's money." Kendrick could not look his mother in the eye. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the security guards. He looked everywhere but at the woman he had completely bankrupted. "Mom, I was going to put it back," he pleaded, his voice taking on a pathetic whining quality. "It was a temporary bridge loan for a massive venture capital acquisition. I just needed the liquidity to secure the deal. Valerie is twisting this to ruin my reputation." He did not get to finish his pathetic excuse. Chloe let out a blood-curdling shriek. The pristine, composed lifestyle influencer completely snapped. She lunged at him, closing the distance between them in a split second. She swung her heavy designer purse with her entire body weight, smashing the gold-plated hardware directly into the side of Kendrick's face. The sound of the impact echoed through the cavernous lobby. Kendrick stumbled sideways, raising his arms to protect himself, but Chloe was relentless. She dropped her phone, the same phone she had just used to threaten me with child protective services, and began pummeling him with her bare hands. She screamed obscenities, her voice raw and tearing, hurling accusations about her children's future and Jamal's trust. "You stole from my babies!" Chloe shrieked, clawing at his tailored suit jacket. "You stole their future to buy a car for some cheap mistress. I will destroy you, Kendrick. Jamal is going to kill you." The immaculate white privilege she loved to weaponize against me had been entirely discarded. She did not care who was watching. She did not care about the wealthy clients or the corporate executives observing the spectacle. Her entire carefully curated world had just been liquidated to fund a 24-year-old's luxury lifestyle, and she wanted blood. Kendrick tried to push her away, but he was clumsy and panicked. He shoved her shoulders, sending her stumbling backward. Before she could recover and launch another attack, my corporate security detail intervened. The two off-duty officers stepped smoothly into the fray, separating them with practiced efficiency. One officer placed a firm hand on Kendrick's chest, pushing him back toward the revolving doors, while the other gently but firmly restrained Chloe. I remained standing exactly where I had been, my posture perfectly straight. I watched the absolute disintegration of the toxic alliance that had tormented me for years. It was a spectacular implosion. Brenda did not rush forward to defend her son. She did not yell at Chloe for assaulting him. The fierce, enabling matriarch had been completely broken. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed heavily into one of the modern leather chairs arranged near the reception desk. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, devastating sobs. She was grappling with the horrifying reality that her own flesh and blood, the son she had prioritized above all logic and reason, had traded her survival for his own vanity. She would have to go back to work at retail minimum wage. She would likely lose her home in Buckhead. Her golden boy had left her with absolutely nothing. The unified front they had brought to my workplace was entirely obliterated. They had marched into my building, intending to demand my immediate termination, hoping to strip away my power and force me into submission. Instead, they had turned on each other the moment the financial truth was exposed. The managing partner of my firm, Richard, stood a few feet away, watching the entire scene with an expression of grim understanding. He looked at me, giving a brief, respectful nod. I had handled a highly volatile personal threat with absolute professional composure. I had not engaged in the chaos. I had simply presented the data and allowed the data to do the destroying. Kendrick stood near the exit, breathing heavily, his designer shirt wrinkled and torn at the collar from Chloe's assault. A dark red mark was already blooming across his cheekbone where the heavy purse had made contact. He looked at his mother sobbing in the chair. He looked at his sister-in-law being held back by a police officer, her face twisted in absolute hatred. He realized in that exact moment that he was completely and utterly isolated. He had lost his primary source of income when I froze his accounts. He had lost his social protection when his mother realized he had robbed her. He had lost his family's financial backing when Chloe discovered the theft of the college funds. He had no safety net left. There was no one left to manipulate into saving him. His chest heaved as he turned his gaze away from the wreckage of his family and locked his eyes directly onto mine. The panic and the pathetic whining evaporated from his face. The charming, charismatic mask he had worn for our entire relationship melted away, leaving nothing but a hollow, terrifying darkness. Realizing he had lost everything, his eyes turned entirely malicious. He was a desperate, cornered animal who had just been stripped of his disguise. He knew he could no longer play the victim. He knew he could no longer rely on his family to fight his battles. He was going to have to come after me himself, and he was going to use the dirtiest, most devastating tactics he could find to make me pay for humiliating him. I watched him push through the heavy glass doors, his shadow stretching across the pavement outside. The two security officers released Chloe, who immediately collapsed onto the floor, scrambling to gather the scattered documents. She was weeping openly, frantically trying to piece the papers back together, as if holding the physical evidence could somehow reverse the transactions. Brenda did not move from her chair. She just stared blankly at the wall, a woman completely hollowed out from the inside. I turned to Richard, my managing partner. "I apologize for the disruption to the lobby," I said, maintaining a calm, even tone. "It will not happen again." Richard adjusted his tie and offered a slight smile. "You handled an audit effectively, Valerie. That is what you do best. Take the rest of the afternoon if you need it." I thanked him but declined. I had a newborn son waiting for me at home in a highly secure penthouse, and I had a desperate, malicious husband planning his next move. Kendrick was stripped of his wealth and his family's support, but I knew a man with a shattered ego was the most dangerous kind of enemy. He would run to the darkest corners of the legal system to find a way to trap me. I gathered my briefcase, turned my back on the weeping women in the lobby, and stepped back into the elevator. The doors slid shut, closing out the chaos and sealing me in the quiet calm of my own making. I pressed the button for the 50th floor, ready to prepare for his next desperate strike. The elevator doors closed quietly, isolating me from the chaos I had just unleashed in the lobby. I returned to my corner office and immediately began fortifying my defensive positions. I knew a man like Kendrick. When a narcissist is stripped of his social protection and his unearned wealth, He does not reflect on his mistakes. He retaliates with blind, desperate malice. He was a cornered animal, and his next move was going to be vicious. I did not have to wait long. 2 days later, a process server bypassed my secure building by ambushing me outside a coffee shop I frequented near the financial district. The heavy manila envelope he shoved into my hands was a masterclass in absolute delusion. Kendrick had filed an emergency ex parte motion for full custody of Caleb. I sat at my kitchen island that evening, reading through the legal filings with a mixture of cold rage and professional disbelief. Kendrick had retained a notoriously unethical attorney. The man was a bottom-feeding lawyer who specialized in harassing high-net-worth spouses with frivolous litigation. Since I had successfully frozen every single asset and line of credit Kendrick possessed, he had undoubtedly secured this legal representation on a promise. He had likely convinced this cut-rate lawyer that I was hoarding massive marital assets and promised him a lucrative payout once the courts forced me to open my accounts. The claims within the affidavit were entirely fraudulent. Kendrick formally alleged that I was aggressively hiding joint capital. He painted a completely fictional narrative, claiming that I had suffered a severe postpartum mental breakdown and that I posed an immediate physical threat to our newborn son. The financial demands attached to the custody filing were even more laughable. He requested $10,000 a month in temporary spousal support. He argued that he needed this monthly stipend to maintain the standard of living established during our marriage. The audacity of his lies fueled my absolute focus. This was a man who had abandoned his wife in active labor to vacation in Cabo San Lucas with a 24-year-old mistress, using funds he had stolen from his own elderly mother. He had never changed a single diaper. He had never rocked his son to sleep. Yet he was legally asserting under penalty of perjury that he was the primary caregiver and the stable parent. He was utilizing the family court system not to protect his child, but as a weapon of financial extortion. He knew that family courts moved deliberately, and he intended to bleed me dry in legal fees until I submitted to his outrageous demands. The preliminary hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. The heavy wooden doors and polished floors of the justice system felt oppressive, but I walked into the building with my head held high. My attorney, a brilliant and ruthless litigator, advised me to remain entirely silent and let the legal process unfold. We were playing a long game, and showing any emotion would only give Kendrick the reaction he desperately craved. Kendrick strutted into the courtroom trying to project his usual commanding aura. However, the cracks in his facade were glaringly obvious. He was wearing a cheap off-the-rack suit that signaled his sudden lack of capital. He had not been able to access his custom-tailored wardrobe since the day I locked him out of the empty suburban house. His eyes darted around the room with frantic, nervous energy. He sat next to his sleazy attorney, projecting false confidence, but I could see the sweat gathering on his forehead. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, took one look at the wildly conflicting financial affidavits and refused to make a rapid ruling. She recognized that the financial web Kendrick had woven was far too complex for an emergency order. She temporarily denied his emergency custody request, leaving Caleb safely in my sole physical care. However, she mandated that we enter mandatory mediation to untangle the asset division. It was a temporary stalemate. It was exactly what I needed. After the brief hearing concluded, I walked out of the courtroom and made my way toward the parking garage. The concrete structure was dimly lit and nearly empty. My personal security detail was waiting in my vehicle one level up, but I had specifically instructed my lawyer to leave through a different exit. I knew Kendrick would not be able to resist the urge to confront me privately, away from the eyes of the judge and the bailiffs. I walked toward the stairwell, my heels clicking sharply against the cold cement, right on cue. Kendrick stepped out from behind a massive concrete pillar, physically blocking my path. His posture was aggressive, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of physical intimidation. The charming, polite mask he had worn inside the courtroom was completely gone. His face was twisted into a malicious sneer, his true character finally bleeding all the way through to the surface. "You think you are so smart, Valerie?" He spat, his voice echoing loudly in the empty parking garage. "You think you can just freeze my money and lock me out of my own house? You think you can embarrass me in front of my family and walk away clean? I stopped walking, but I did not step back. I maintained a comfortable distance, my face a mask of absolute indifference. I am walking away clean, Kendrick, I replied calmly. You are the one standing in the wreckage of your own choices. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, taking a step closer. You are not walking away from anything. I am going to drag you through this family court system for the next 18 years. I will file motion after motion. I will demand psychological evaluations. I will fight for primary custody, and I will make sure the judge orders you to pay for my entire legal team. I will bleed your corporate accounts dry. I will make your life a living hell every single day until that kid turns 18. He took another step, lowering his voice to a threatening, arrogant whisper. But we can make all of this go away right now. You restore my credit lines today. You give me the keys to the new property, and you drop this ridiculous divorce filing. You give me my lifestyle back, and I will let you keep the kid. You know I do not want to raise a screaming baby anyway. It is your choice, Valerie. You either fund my life, or I destroy yours. He smirked, confident in his manipulation. He truly believed he had backed me into a corner I could never escape. He thought he could outsmart me by weaponizing the very child he had abandoned. He crossed his arms, looking down at me with absolute unwavering arrogance. You cannot outsmart the family courts, Valerie, he stated triumphantly. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of fear or hesitation. I simply reached down and adjusted the strap of my leather briefcase. I looked him dead in the eye, allowing the full weight of my calculated silence to crush his arrogant smirk. I have no intention of outsmarting the family courts, Kendrick. I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of all emotion. I only needed to delay you long enough for the federal agents to conclude their audit of your shell companies. The sterile beige walls of the County Mediation Center were a far cry from the velvet-lined boardrooms Kendrick usually preferred. We sat across from each other at a long, scratched mahogany table. The mediator, a tired-looking man in a wrinkled suit, sat at the head of the table, shuffling through a stack of our wildly conflicting financial affidavits. My attorney sat to my right, radiating the quiet, lethal confidence of a professional who already knew the verdict. Kendrick sat to my left next to his sleazy lawyer. He leaned back in his squeaky rolling chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He was exuding that same unearned, toxic confidence he had tried to weaponize against me in the parking garage just days prior. He truly believed his fraudulent emergency custody filing gave him the ultimate upper hand. He thought the threat of a prolonged, agonizing legal battle over our son would break my spirit and force me to open my checkbook. His lawyer, a man who looked like he had not slept in 3 days, began the proceedings with a theatrical sigh. He laid out Kendrick's demands with absolute shamelessness. My client is willing to drop the emergency custody injunction and settle for joint custody, he droned, tapping a cheap pen against his legal pad. In exchange, we require the immediate restoration of the 2 vehicles, a monthly spousal support stipend of $10,000, and the keys to the new downtown property. We also expect Valerie to cover all legal fees associated with this transition. I listened to the laundry list of extortion without changing my expression. Kendrick was watching me closely, waiting for the panic to set in. He wanted to see my hands shake. He wanted me to beg him to be reasonable. He wanted to feel like a king offering clemency to his disobedient subject. Instead, I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I placed it face up on the table right in the center so the screen was visible to everyone. The mediator stopped talking. Kendrick's lawyer frowned, confused by the disruption. I looked directly at the man I had once promised to build a life with. Kendrick, I suggest you review your primary email. I said, my voice slicing through the stuffy air of the mediation room like a scalpel. Not your personal account. Check the encrypted server you use for your venture capital firm. Kendrick scoffed, rolling his eyes and shifting in his chair. I am not playing your games, Valerie. We are in a legally mandated mediation. You either agree to the terms my lawyer just outlined, or we take this back to the judge and I take full custody of Caleb. My attorney leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I strongly advise you to check your email, Kendrick. What you are about to read supersedes any family court jurisdiction. The unwavering certainty in my lawyer's voice finally pierced Kendrick's arrogant armor. His jaw tightened. He pulled his phone from his pocket, unlocking the screen with a quick, aggressive swipe. He navigated to his secure mail application. I watched the exact moment the floor fell out from under him. The email waiting at the top of his inbox was not a marketing newsletter or a spam notification. It was an urgent official dispatch from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. It was a formal notification of a massive multi-agency federal probe into his entire financial existence. 3 weeks prior, while I was sitting in my hospital bed recovering from labor and tracing the funds he used to buy his mistress, a luxury condo. I had not just downloaded the evidence for my divorce proceedings. I had meticulously compiled a comprehensive airtight dossier of his financial crimes. I had organized the forged signatures, the offshore wire transfers, the falsified tax returns, and the deliberate misappropriation of his mother's retirement funds. I had packaged it all into a secure anonymous tip and submitted it directly to the federal authorities. I knew the family court system was slow and easily manipulated by pathological liars. But the federal government does not play games with wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I just needed to keep Kendrick distracted with his petty custody threats long enough for the federal agents to verify the data and build their case. Kendrick's eyes darted frantically across his phone screen, reading the devastating legal jargon. The email outlined irrefutable forensic evidence of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion spanning a period of 6 years. It listed the exact routing numbers he had used to launder money through the Cayman Islands. It named the dummy corporations he had set up to hide the stolen college funds from his own brother. The feds had everything. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen and hollow. The phone slipped from his fingers, hitting the wooden table with a sharp clatter. His sleazy lawyer grabbed the device, his eyes widening as he read the federal notice. The lawyer instantly recognized that he was sitting next to a radioactive client who was about to be indicted on multiple federal felony charges. The promise of a lucrative payout evaporated, instantly replaced by the terrifying realization that he might be implicated if he continued to represent a man actively under federal investigation. Kendrick looked up at me, his chest heaving, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You!" He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "You did this. You set me up." "I did not set you up, Kendrick," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "I simply turned on the lights. You are the one who spent 6 years operating in the dark. You stole from your mother. You stole from your brother. You stole from me. You built an entire life out of other people's money, and you actually believed you were a genius for getting away with it." He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Valerie, you have to call them off. You have to tell them the money was a joint marital asset. Tell them we had a verbal agreement. If the feds freeze my accounts, I am ruined. I am going to federal prison." I sat perfectly still, absorbing his absolute desperation. "You are already ruined, Kendrick. Your accounts are not just frozen, they are empty. And I cannot call off a federal investigation any more than I could call off my own labor when you abandoned me for a vacation in Cabo." The mediator, who had been watching this unfold in stunned silence, slowly closed his folder. "It appears," he said carefully, "that the financial landscape of this mediation has fundamentally changed." Kendrick was hyperventilating now, the reality of his impending incarceration crushing his lungs. He reached across the table, his hands trembling, reaching out as if to grab my arm. "Please, Valerie, I will drop the custody suit. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you full custody of Caleb. Just help me fix this." I looked down at his shaking hands and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no lingering attachment. The man sitting across from me was a total stranger, a pathetic parasite who had finally run out of hosts to feed on. I leaned in slightly, delivering my final verdict. "I do not need you to give me custody of my son, Kendrick. You lost him the moment you forged those documents and boarded that plane. The family court cannot save you now, and neither can I." The silence in the mediation room was absolute following my declaration. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on Kendrick as his brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his defeat. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling the narrative and now the script had been entirely rewritten by the woman he thought he could easily discard. Before the mediator could even clear his throat to formally suspend the proceedings, the heavy wooden door to the conference room violently burst open. The heavy panel slammed against the drywall with a resounding crack that made everyone in the room flinch. I turned my head, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Standing in the doorway was Kiara. She looked absolutely nothing like the polished, glamorous 24-year-old woman who had boarded a private jet to Cabo San Lucas just a few weeks prior. The curated Instagram aesthetic was completely gone. She was wearing a pair of basic sweatpants and a rumpled, oversized hoodie. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unkempt ponytail, and her face was blotchy and red from extensive crying. She was trembling so violently that the thick stack of legal papers clutched in her hands shook like leaves in a hurricane. Kendrick reacted purely on instinct, relying on the narcissistic delusion that he was still the main character of a romantic drama. He saw his young, beautiful mistress, standing in the doorway in obvious distress, and he immediately assumed she was there to support him. He thought she had somehow heard about the family turmoil and rushed to the courthouse to provide him with an alibi or emotional comfort. He believed she was his loyal soldier, ready to defend her successful older man against his bitter, jealous wife. He pushed his rolling chair back and stood up quickly, smoothing the front of his cheap suit jacket. He took a step toward her, projecting a false aura of protective masculine authority. "Kiara, baby, what are you doing here?" Kendrick asked, his voice dropping an octave into a soothing, patronizing tone. "You should not have come to the courthouse. It is okay. I have my lawyer here. We are handling Valerie right now. Just wait for me outside." Kiara did not rush into his arms. She did not seek his protection. Instead, she recoiled violently, taking a large step backward as if he were physically radioactive. "Do not call me that!" she screamed, her voice cracking and echoing down the quiet courthouse hallway. "Do not you ever speak to me again, you lying, pathetic thief." Kendrick froze, his outstretched hand dropping to his side. The protective patriarch mask slipped, revealing a profound confusion. "Kiara, what is wrong with you? You need to calm down and wait outside before you make a scene." Kiara marched fully into the mediation room, ignoring the mediator and Kendrick's sleazy attorney. She walked directly up to the scratched mahogany table and slammed the thick stack of papers down with tremendous force. The document slid across the polished surface, stopping just inches from my own neatly folded hands. The topmost document was a federal subpoena issued by the United States District Court. "I woke up at 6 o'clock this morning to federal agents pounding on my front door," Kiara shrieked, tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her makeup. Heavily armed agents in tactical gear raided my building. They woke up the entire floor. They came inside and seized my phone, my laptop, and every single bank card in my wallet. They told me I had to vacate the premises by the end of the week because the property is subject to federal asset forfeiture. Kendrick swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Kiara, you do not understand. It is a misunderstanding with the business accounts. I can fix it. I will call my guys." "You do not have any guys?" Kiara sobbed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated panic. "The agents took me down to the federal building in a black SUV. They put me in an interrogation room for 4 hours. Do you know what they showed me, Kendrick? Do you know what they put on the table right in front of my face?" Kendrick was completely silent, his breathing ragged and audible. "They showed me the bank transfers," Kiara continued, her voice rising in pitch. "They showed me the routing numbers you used to buy the penthouse. You told me you were a multimillionaire venture capitalist. You told me you were separating from a toxic wife who controlled your trust fund. But they showed me the truth. You do not have a venture capital firm. You stole that money from your 65-year-old mother. You forged your own brother's signature to empty out your nieces' and nephews' college accounts. You used stolen family money to buy me a condo and designer bags." She pointed a shaking finger directly at his face, her expression a mixture of profound disgust and absolute terror. "The federal agents told me that because the property is in my name, and because the offshore wires were routed through my accounts, I am legally considered an accessory to massive corporate wire fraud and money laundering. They told me I was looking at 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy. I am 24 years old, Kendrick. I am not going to a federal penitentiary for a man who steals from his own elderly mother." Kendrick looked like he was going to vomit. His eyes darted toward the door, measuring the distance, calculating if he could somehow sprint out of the building and escape the crushing weight of his reality. But there was nowhere left to run. His passport had likely already been flagged by the authorities, and his accounts were completely dead. Kiara took a deep, shuddering breath, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I told them everything, she said, her voice dropping into a cold, deadly whisper. I sat in that interrogation room, and I sang like a canary. I gave them the passwords to the secondary burner phones you kept in the apartment. I gave them the text messages where you bragged about bypassing the offshore limits. I handed over the login credentials to the dummy corporations you used to wash the funds. Kendrick slumped against the edge of the conference table, gripping the wood to keep his legs from buckling. You what? You talked to them without a lawyer. I had a lawyer, Kiara shot back. A federal public defender walked into the room and told me exactly what I needed to do to save my own life. I signed a formal proffer agreement, Kendrick. I accepted a plea deal. I turned state's evidence this morning. I have full blanket immunity for my complete and total cooperation. I am the star witness against you. The mediation room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vent overhead. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my briefcase, absorbing the spectacular poetic justice unfolding in front of me. Kendrick had built his entire fragile ego around his ability to manipulate women. He had used me for my pristine credit score and my steady income. He had used his mother for her blind, unwavering adoration and her retirement savings. I had used Kiara to validate his youth and his fake wealth. I thought women were simply resources to be drained and discarded at his convenience. Now the very woman he had abandoned his wife and newborn son for was standing in a county courthouse, handing the federal prosecutors the final nails for his coffin. It was a flawless execution, and I did not have to lift a single finger. Kendrick's sleazy attorney, a man who had started this mediation by demanding $10,000 a month in spousal support, stood up abruptly. The scraping of his chair against the linoleum floor broke the tension in the room. He did not bother organizing his notes. He simply shoved his legal pads and pens indiscriminately into his worn leather briefcase. Mr. Sterling, the attorney said, addressing Kendrick in a rapid, nervous clip. Given the sudden and severe escalation of your legal situation involving a multi-agency federal criminal investigation, I am formally withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately. I am a family law practitioner. I do not handle federal wire fraud or corporate embezzlement. I strongly suggest you remain silent and attempt to secure a federal criminal defense attorney, though considering your asset freeze, that may prove difficult. The lawyer did not wait for a response. He snapped his briefcase shut, gave a curt nod to the mediator, and practically sprinted out of the room, desperate to distance himself from the radioactive disaster standing next to the table. Kendrick was entirely alone. He had no money, no credit, no family support, no lawyer, and now no mistress. He turned his gaze back to Kiara, his face twisting into an ugly, malicious scowl. The charming provider mask was completely gone, replaced by the aggressive venom of an exposed narcissist. You ungrateful little gold digger, he hissed, taking a threatening step toward her. I gave you everything. I put a roof over your head. I took you across the world. And you fold the second the feds ask you a question. You are nothing without me. My attorney stood up immediately, shifting his physical presence to insert himself into the space, ensuring Kendrick could not advance any further. The mediator quickly reached for the phone on his desk, pressing the button for courthouse security. I finally stood up, slowly pushing my chair back. I smoothed the front of my tailored suit jacket, adjusting my cuffs with absolute meticulous care. I looked at the man who had ruined his own life. She folded because she is smart, Kendrick. I said, my voice calm and completely detached. She looked at the balance sheet and realized you were a liability. That is what happens when you build an empire on stolen capital. Eventually, the true owners come to collect, and everyone else abandons ship to avoid going down with you. I picked up my briefcase. The same briefcase containing the secure financial documents I had used to orchestrate this entire takedown. I looked at Kiara, who was standing by the door, clutching her immunity agreement like a lifeline. I did not thank her, and I did not pity her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the reality of her involvement. but she had served her purpose perfectly. I turned back to Kendrick, delivering my final absolute verdict. My son's father ceased to exist the moment he boarded that flight to Cabo, I stated, looking directly into his terrified, panicked eyes. Enjoy your permanent vacation, Kendrick. I hear the federal accommodations are incredibly secure. I did not wait to see the courthouse deputies arrive to escort him from the building. I walked out of the mediation room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floors, leaving the wreckage of his fraudulent life entirely behind me. The heavy wooden doors of the mediation center swung shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic sounds of Kendrick realizing his life was over. I walked down the polished marble corridor of the courthouse, my heels clicking in a steady rhythmic cadence. I did not rush. I had nowhere to be except safely back in my penthouse with my son. Every step I took felt like shedding a physical weight I had carried for years. Valerie, wait. The frantic, desperate voice echoed down the hallway. I stopped and turned slowly. Brenda was rushing toward me, her designer shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor. The fiercely arrogant matriarch, who had marched into my corporate lobby just days ago, demanding my termination, was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, broken woman whose entire world had just been liquidated. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her makeup was ruined from crying. She caught up to me, reaching out to grab my arm. I stepped back smoothly, completely denying her physical access to my personal space. She dropped her trembling hands, clutching her expensive leather purse like a shield. "You cannot do this!" Valerie, Brenda pleaded, her voice cracking with raw panic. "You have to go back in there. You have to call those federal agents and tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them the money was a joint asset. You have the power to stop this. He is going to federal prison. You have to save him. You have to save the father of your child." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire marriage belittling my career and treating her son like an untouchable deity. She had enabled his narcissism, funded his delusions, and actively participated in a vicious smear campaign against my sanity. And now, when the consequences of his actions had finally arrived at her doorstep, she expected me to fall on my sword to protect him. I looked her dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of sympathy. "I told you in the lobby, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly calm and resolute. "He used your money to buy a luxury condo for a 24-year-old woman. He stole from his own brother. And he abandoned his wife in active labor to drink tequila on a beach. He is not a victim. He is a predator. And my son has no father. His father ceased to exist the moment he chose his ego over his family. But my retirement," Brenda sobbed, the reality of her own financial ruin finally eclipsing her devotion to her son. "He took everything from me, Valerie. I have nothing left. How am I supposed to survive?" I adjusted my grip on my briefcase, the smooth leather grounding me. "You should have thought about your survival before you handed over the keys to your life savings to a man who refuses to work for a living," I replied coldly. "I highly suggest you start looking for employment." I turned my back on her, leaving her weeping alone in the echoing courthouse hallway. I pressed the button for the elevator, stepped inside, and watched the metallic doors slide shut. The visual of Brenda collapsing against the marble wall was the last time I ever had to deal with my toxic in-laws. Fast forward 6 months. The federal justice system moves with terrifying efficiency when handed a perfectly organized, forensically verified dossier of corporate embezzlement. Kendrick never stood a chance. He tried to hire a public defender, but his arrogant attitude and refusal to take accountability alienated his own legal counsel. He actually attempted to charm the federal judge during his hearings, deploying that same smooth corporate executive persona he used to manipulate women. It failed spectacularly. Kiara the Mistress took the witness stand during the proceedings. Armed with her full immunity deal, she detailed every single offshore wire transfer, every luxury purchase, and every dummy corporation Kendrick had established. She handed the prosecution all of his burner phones and private encrypted messages. The evidence was insurmountable. Kendrick was found guilty on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement. Because federal sentencing guidelines are mandatory and severe, he was given no leniency. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. He was stripped of his tailored suits and handed a standard-issue prison uniform. The fake venture capitalist was finally exactly where he belonged, locked in a cell with absolutely no access to the internet or social media. The collateral damage of Kendrick's financial crimes completely annihilated his family structure. Jamal, his older brother, was left to grapple with the devastating reality that his children's entire college fund had been wiped out to purchase a G-Wagon for a mistress. Jamal was a hard-working man, but the financial betrayal broke his spirit. He had to take on a second job just to keep his household afloat. But Chloe, his privileged, condescending wife, did not stick around to help him rebuild. The moment Chloe realized the money was gone and the social standing of the family was permanently destroyed, her conditional loyalty evaporated. She did not care about the vows she took or the family unit she constantly bragged about online. Her white privilege and her demand for absolute comfort superseded any attachment she had to Jamal. Chloe filed for divorce the very next morning. She packed up her designer clothes, took her children, and moved straight back into her wealthy parents' sprawling estate in the suburbs. She completely scrubbed her social media accounts, deleting every single photograph of Jamal and his family, as if they had never existed. She abandoned the black family she had only ever tolerated for their perceived wealth, leaving Jamal to pick up the shattered pieces of his life entirely alone. The toxic alliance that had constantly tried to put me in my place was permanently dead. Brenda faced the most brutal reckoning of all. The bank foreclosed on her massive brick home in Buckhead exactly 2 months after Kendrick was indicted. With her pension gone, her mutual funds liquidated, and her life insurance payout stolen, she was entirely bankrupt. At 65 years old, a woman who had spent her life judging others for their lack of status was forced to re-enter the workforce just to keep a roof over her head. I saw her once completely by accident. I was walking through a high-end department store in downtown Atlanta, picking up a gift for a client. I spotted Brenda standing near the clearance racks. She was wearing a standard retail uniform, a cheap name tag pinned to her chest. She was spending 8 hours a day on her feet folding sweaters and dealing with entitled customers. She looked up and our eyes met across the crowded store. I did not smile and I did not gloat. I simply looked at her, observing the absolute exhaustion radiating from her posture. The arrogant, fiercely enabling matriarch was completely gone. She quickly looked down at the table, pretending to focus on a stack of denim jeans, deeply ashamed of her new reality. I continued walking, never looking back. My own life had transformed into something profoundly beautiful. The chaos, the gaslighting, and the constant financial drain were entirely eradicated. I was no longer dimming my light to protect the fragile ego of a narcissistic man. I was no longer shrinking myself to fit into a family that viewed my success as a threat. I sat on the expansive private terrace of my highly secure, sun-drenched penthouse. The warm Atlanta breeze drifted across the balcony, carrying the faint, distant hum of the city below. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. A few feet away, my son Caleb was sleeping peacefully in his luxury bassinet. He was healthy, growing, and completely insulated from the toxicity that had almost defined his early days. He would never know the sound of raised voices or the tension of financial deceit. He would grow up in a home filled with absolute peace, stability, and unconditional love. I took a slow sip of my coffee, resting my hand on the smooth glass table. I opened my laptop, logging into my secure corporate network. My firm had just finalized the details of a massive, highly profitable corporate acquisition, and as a senior partner track auditor, my final approval was required. I reviewed the complex financial architecture of the deal, marveling at the clean, honest mathematics on the screen. I scrolled to the bottom of the digital document. I typed my name into the authorization box and hit submit, securing a massive commission that would go directly into Caleb's private trust fund. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes and lifting my face toward the warm sun. There were no fake apologies to entertain. There were no manipulative family members demanding my money. There was no husband draining my bank accounts to fund his delusions. There was only the gentle sound of my son breathing and the absolute undeniable silence of victory. After 3 weeks with his mistress, my husband finally came to see our son. The nurse looked at him and said, "Your wife left 3 weeks ago." Let me tell you how I turned his tropical getaway into a permanent eviction from my life and dismantled his entire fake empire, brick by brick. I am Valerie, 35 years old, and today I am holding my newborn son in a quiet, peaceful home. But just weeks ago, I was fighting a war I did not even know I was in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who thought you were just a supporting character in their life.